Years of working under the scorching sun had carved deep lines into Thomas Anderson's weathered face, now streaked with tears of shame. As Judge Harrison prepared to deliver his verdict, no one could have predicted how this seemingly simple case of crop theft would expose a shocking truth that would shake their tight-knit farming community to its core. Thomas Anderson stood motionless in the packed courtroom, his sun-weathered face ashen with fear and exhaustion. His work-hardened hands, now trembling slightly, clutched an old straw hat against his chest like a shield. The once proud farmer, known throughout Millbrook Valley for his prize-winning corn, now looked small and defeated beneath the towering mahogany bench. The pristine courtroom, with its polished wooden panels and gleaming brass fixtures, seemed to mock the dirt and calluses that marked him as a man of the earth. Around him, the modern courthouse buzzed with whispers and judgment. Faces he'd known his entire life, neighbors, fellow farmers, and local shopkeepers, all stared at him with a mix of pity and disdain. Some had known him since he was a boy, working alongside his father in the fertile fields that had fed their community for generations. Now they watched him like spectators at a tragic play, their whispers cutting through the air like autumn wind through bare branches. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting harsh shadows across the polished floor, much like the shadows that had been creeping across Thomas's own life over the past year. The light caught the silver threads in his prematurely greying hair, evidence of the strain that had aged him well beyond his 45 years. His once straight shoulders, which had carried sacks of grain and bundles of hay with pride, now slumped under the weight of shame and desperation. At the judge's bench sat the Honourable William Harrison, a man whose reputation for harsh sentences preceded him throughout 3 counties. His steel-grey eyes peered down at Thomas over gold-rimmed glasses, his expression as cold and unyielding as the gavel he gripped in his hand. The judge's presence seemed to fill the entire room, making even the court officers shift uncomfortably in their positions. Judge Harrison was known for his unwavering dedication to the letter of the law, a man who had never worked a day in the fields, but sat in judgment of those who did. The courthouse clock ticked loudly in the tense silence, each second echoing like a hammer fall. In the front row sat Margaret Anderson, Thomas's wife of 23 years, her fingers working the worn fabric of her best dress, the same one she'd worn to church every Sunday for the past decade. Beside her sat their youngest son, Dany, his teenage face a mask of confusion and hurt as he watched his father, his hero, standing trial like a common criminal. Behind them, taking up nearly 2 full rows, sat the representatives of Heartland Agricultural Corporation. Their crisp suits and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the working clothes of the local farmers who filled the rest of the courtroom. At their center sat Clayton Hughes, the regional director, his perfectly manicured hands folded neatly in his lap, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched the proceedings with the detached interest of a man observing insects. The air in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing moment, thick with the unspoken stories of drought, debt, and desperation that had brought them all to this point. The ancient heating system hummed somewhere in the building's bowels, its sound mixing with the rustle of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. Through the tall windows, the farms of Millbrook Valley could be seen stretching into the distance, their winter-bare fields waiting for a spring that seemed impossibly far away. Court Officer Jenkins, who had coached Thomas's baseball team 20 years ago, now stood rigid beside him, avoiding eye contact with the man he'd once celebrated as a local hero. The American flag behind the judge's bench hung still and solemn, its stars and stripes a silent witness to the drama unfolding beneath it. On the judge's desk, a stack of papers told the official story. Police reports, property documents, and statements that reduced Thomas Anderson's life to a series of cold, legal facts. The whole scene seemed surreal, like something from a movie. rather than the real life of a man who had spent his entire existence nurturing the land and feeding his community. But as Judge Harrison cleared his throat, preparing to begin the proceedings, the reality of the situation came crashing down on Thomas with devastating clarity. His fingers tightened around his hat, the straw cracking slightly under the pressure, as he prepared to face whatever justice this morning would bring. Mr. Anderson stands accused of grand larceny and criminal trespassing. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the silence like a scythe through wheat. Specifically, the theft of proprietary seed samples from Heartland Agricultural Corporation's research facility. The judge's words hung in the air as he shuffled through the papers before him, each movement deliberate and measured. Clayton Hughes rose smoothly from his seat, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. As he approached the witness stand, the regional director of Heartland Agricultural Corporation carried himself with the confident air of a man accustomed to getting his way. His tailored charcoal suit and burgundy tie spoke of wealth that most farmers in Millbrook Valley couldn't imagine in a lifetime. "Your Honor," Hughes began, his voice cultured and smooth as aged whiskey. "Heartland Agricultural Corporation has invested millions in developing drought-resistant crops. The defendant didn't just steal seeds, he stole years of research and development." He turned slightly, ensuring the jury could see his practiced expression of corporate concern. "We're not just talking about a handful of seeds here. We're talking about intellectual property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." From her seat in the front row, Margaret Anderson watched her husband's shoulders tense at the word defendant. She remembered when Thomas had been called other things: neighbor, friend, community leader. For 15 years he'd served as president of the Millbrook Valley Agricultural Coalition, helping small farmers band together to survive in an increasingly corporate farming world. Now he stood alone, labeled a thief by the very industry that had been slowly choking the life out of family farms like theirs. District Attorney Rachel Chen, a rising star in the prosecutor's office, approached the bench with precise steps. Her reputation for securing convictions in corporate cases had made her a natural choice for Heartland's legal team. The evidence will show that on the night of November 15th, Mr. Anderson broke into Heartland's facility, accessed their secure seed storage unit and stole samples of their latest drought-resistant corn variety. Thomas's court-appointed defender, James Martinez, shifted in his chair. Fresh out of law school and drowning in student debt, he had been assigned this case just 2 weeks ago. The young lawyer's ill-fitting suit and nervous demeanor stood in stark contrast to the polished corporate legal team facing him across the courtroom. In the gallery, old Bill Jenkins, who owned the farm supply store, leaned forward with concern, etched on his weathered face. He remembered how Thomas had helped him rebuild after the tornado of '98, refusing payment even though his own barn needed repairs. Now Bill watched helplessly as his friend faced up to 10 years in prison for what seemed, to many locals, like a desperate act rather than a real crime. The prosecution's table was crowded with corporate lawyers, their tablets and smartphones, forming a technological barrier between them and the wooden simplicity of the historic courtroom. Each of them carried folders thick with patents, agricultural regulations, and corporate ownership documents, the paper weapons of modern agricultural warfare. Judge Harrison's clerk, Sarah Matthews, had grown up on a farm herself before pursuing her legal career. As she organized the day's documents, she couldn't help but notice how the case file told 2 very different stories. One was filled with corporate spreadsheets, profit projections, and shareholder reports. The other contained photographs of withered crops, foreclosure notices, and desperate letters from farmers seeking help against the rising tide of corporate agriculture. Dany Anderson, 16, and already showing the height and strength that marked the men in his family, sat rigid beside his mother. His mind wandered to the previous spring, when he'd proudly told his father he wanted to be a farmer too. Now he watched as that same father stood accused of crimes that threatened to destroy not just their family's legacy, but their entire way of life. At the defense table, Thomas finally looked up, his eyes meeting those of Clayton Hughes. The corporate executive's slight smirk spoke volumes about the power imbalance in the room. Hughes represented a new breed of agricultural businessman, one who had never felt the soil between his fingers or watched a crop wither under a merciless sun. His world was one of stockholder meetings and profit margins, far removed from the earthy reality of actual farming. The morning light continued to stream through the high windows, creating a spotlight effect on the courtroom floor. To one side stood the might of corporate agriculture, suits, briefcases, and the weight of millions in legal resources. To the other, a single farmer in his Sunday best, his calloused hands marking him as a man who worked the land rather than owned it from afar. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, preparing to begin the formal proceedings. The weight of precedent hung heavy in the air. This case would do more than decide the fate of Thomas Anderson. It would send a message about the future of farming in Millbrook Valley, about who really owned the seeds that had passed from farmer to farmer for generations before companies started claiming them as intellectual property. The prosecution may present its case, Judge Harrison announced, his voice echoing through the now silent courtroom. District Attorney Chen rose gracefully, her heels clicking purposefully as she approached the jury box. The 12 men and women, a mix of suburban professionals and small-town workers, shifted in their seats under her practiced gaze. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice carrying the polished tone of someone who had rehearsed extensively, "this case is simple. On November 15th, security cameras captured Thomas Anderson breaking into Heartland Agricultural Corporation's research facility at 2:17 a.m. The defendant bypassed security systems, accessed restricted areas, and stole proprietary seed samples. Valued at over $500,000, Chen activated a large screen mounted on the courtroom wall. The grainy security footage showed a figure in dark clothing moving through Heartland's facility. "The evidence is irrefutable," she continued, freezing the frame where the figure's face was briefly illuminated. Thomas's features were clearly visible, his expression a mask of determination and desperation. "But this isn't just about theft," Chen's voice hardened. "This is about corporate espionage. Mr. Anderson didn't steal these seeds to plant them. He stole them to undermine Heartland's entire research program. The defendant had recently lost a contract bid to Heartland and was facing foreclosure. This was an act of revenge, plain and simple." In the gallery, Margaret Anderson's hands clenched into fists as she watched the corporate lawyer paint her husband as some kind of agricultural spy. She remembered the real reason Thomas had been at the facility that night, the reason they had agreed to keep secret even now. Their youngest daughter Emily's medical bills from her battle with leukemia had drained their savings, and the bank was threatening to take everything. Clayton Hughes was called as the first witness. He took the stand with the confidence of someone accustomed to boardroom presentations, adjusting his tie as he settled into the witness chair. Heartland Agricultural Corporation has invested over $50 million in developing these drought-resistant strains, he testified, his voice carrying just the right note of corporate concern. "We're not just protecting our investment, we're protecting the future of agriculture." The young defense attorney, Martinez, shifted nervously as he prepared for cross-examination. His suit, bought second-hand for his first court appearance, seemed to hang even more loosely on his thin frame. "Mr. Hughes," he began, his voice initially wavering before finding its strength, "could you explain to the court the origin of these seed varieties?" Hughes's practiced smile flickered slightly. They were developed in our research facilities using cutting-edge genetic modification techniques. Isn't it true, Martinez continued, gaining confidence, that these seeds were developed from heirloom varieties that farmers like Mr. Anderson had been cultivating for generations? Several farmers in the gallery leaned forward, their faces showing growing interest. "Objection, Your Honor!" Chen's voice cut through the air. "The origin of the seed varieties is irrelevant to the theft charges." "Sustained," Judge Harrison declared, firmly. "Mr. Martinez, please stick to the facts of the case at hand." From his seat at the defense table, Thomas watched as his entire life's work was reduced to corporate property rights and dollar values. He thought about his father and his father's father, who had saved seeds each season, carefully selecting the strongest plants to ensure next year's crop would be even better. Now, those same farming practices were being labeled as theft by people who had never worked a day in the fields. The security guard who had been on duty that night was called next. Officer Robert Turner, a former military man who had taken the job at Heartland after returning from overseas, approached the stand. His testimony was precise, military style. Times, locations, procedures followed. But when he described finding Thomas alone in the seed vault, his voice softened almost imperceptibly. "The defendant was just standing there," Turner recalled. "He had the seeds in his hands, but he wasn't running. When I asked him what he was doing, he looked at me and said, 'Trying to save my family.'" The guard's words hung in the air, causing several jury members to exchange glances. District Attorney Chen quickly redirected the testimony back to procedures and protocols, but the moment of humanity had already rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Harrison's stern expression had flickered briefly, though he quickly resumed his mask of judicial impartiality. In the back of the courtroom, local newspaper reporter Sarah Collins scribbled furiously in her notebook. She had covered Millbrook Valley's gradual transformation from a community of family farms to corporate agricultural land for the past decade. This case was more than just a simple theft. It was the story of a dying way of life, of desperate people facing impossible choices. The morning wore on as more witnesses took the stand. Security experts detailing the sophisticated systems Thomas had somehow bypassed, corporate accountants calculating the exact value of the stolen intellectual property, agricultural scientists explaining the years of research that went into developing the drought-resistant strains. With each testimony, the weight of evidence seemed to press Thomas further down in his chair, the distance between his small family farm and Heartland's corporate empire growing ever wider. As the prosecution built its case, brick by careful brick, the real tragedy unfolding in the courtroom became clear to those who knew where to look. This wasn't just about stolen seeds. It was about the theft of a heritage, the slow strangulation of a way of life that had sustained communities for generations. But in the eyes of the law, such considerations were irrelevant to the cold, hard facts being presented. The afternoon session began with Thomas Anderson taking the stand. The creak of the old wooden chair seemed to echo his discomfort as he settled into the witness box. Judge Harrison's steely gaze fixed upon him as he raised his right hand to take the oath, his weathered fingers trembling slightly in the harsh, fluorescent light. "Mr. Anderson," James Martinez began, adjusting his tie nervously, "could you tell the court about the events that led to that night at Heartland's facility?" Thomas cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "It started 3 years ago," he began, his eyes distant with memory. "The droughts came first. Not the normal dry spells we're used to, but something different, the kind that turns the earth to dust and makes the corn wither before it can even tassel." The courtroom fell silent as Thomas continued, his words painting a picture of gradual devastation. "We tried everything, new irrigation systems, crop rotation, even selling off half our dairy herd to buy drought-resistant seeds from Heartland." He paused, swallowing hard. But those seeds, they were different. They wouldn't produce viable offspring for the next season. We had to buy new ones every year, at prices that kept climbing. From her seat, Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as her husband described their descent into financial ruin. She remembered the night they'd sat at their kitchen table, bills spread out before them like a paper prophecy of doom. The mortgage papers, the medical bills, the loan statements, all demanding payment with an urgency that seemed to mock their empty bank account. Then Emily got sick. Thomas's voice cracked slightly. Our youngest. The doctors found leukemia in her blood. She needed specialized treatment at the children's hospital in the city. Insurance wouldn't cover most of it because we'd had to switch to a cheaper plan after the first bad harvest. District Attorney Chen stood up. Objection, Your Honor. While Mr. Anderson's personal circumstances are unfortunate, they're irrelevant to the charges of theft and corporate espionage. Your Honor, Martinez countered, finding strength in his client's story. These circumstances are directly relevant to establishing Mr. Anderson's state of mind and motivation. This goes to the heart of intent. Judge Harrison paused, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on his desk. I'll allow it, but keep it focused, Mr. Martinez. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he revealed the truth he'd kept hidden. The seeds I took, they weren't just any seeds. They were developed from the same strain my grandfather brought over from Ireland during the potato famine. Heartland bought the rights to them from farmers who didn't know what they were selling. They modified them, patented them, and then sold them back to us at prices we couldn't afford. In the gallery, several older farmers nodded in recognition. They remembered when seeds were shared freely between neighbors, when a handshake meant more than a contract, when farming was about feeding people rather than feeding profits to shareholders. Last summer, Thomas went on, our crops failed again. The bank was threatening foreclosure. Emily's treatments couldn't wait. I went to Heartland, tried to explain our situation, asked if we could work something out. His hands clenched in his lap. Mr. Hughes told me that's not how business works anymore. He offered to buy our land instead, at a quarter of its value. Clayton Hughes shifted uncomfortably in his seat as several jury members glanced his way. The corporate executive's practiced smile had faded slightly as Thomas's testimony continued. That night at the facility, Thomas's voice grew quiet. I wasn't trying to steal their research or hurt their business. I just wanted to get back what was ours. Seeds that could reproduce naturally. Seeds that my family had cultivated for generations before Heartland claimed them as intellectual property. A murmur ran through the courtroom as Thomas revealed how he'd discovered that Heartland maintained a vault of original, unmodified seed strains, the parent plants from which their patented varieties were developed. Many of these had been acquired from family farms across the country, often through complex contracts that farmers hadn't fully understood. The security guard found me in the vault, Thomas admitted. But I wasn't taking the modified seeds. I was looking for our heritage, the seeds my grandfather brought over, the ones that could help us survive without going deeper into debt every spring. Martinez produced a stack of old photographs and farming journals. Your Honor, I'd like to enter these into evidence. They document the Anderson family's cultivation of these specific crop varieties, dating back to 1892. He handed them to the clerk, who passed them to Judge Harrison. The judge examined the yellowed pages carefully, his expression thoughtful as he studied photographs of Thomas's grandfather standing proudly in fields of corn, detailed notes about seed selection and crop rotation, written in faded ink. From her seat in the jury box, Emma Richardson, who ran the local diner, found herself thinking about the fresh produce Thomas had supplied her restaurant with for years. She remembered how he'd always thrown in extra vegetables for the senior citizens' lunch program, never asking for payment. Now she understood the true cost of the corporate farming that had been slowly taking over their valley. The night I went into the facility, Thomas continued, his voice steady now. Emily was in the hospital for another round of chemotherapy. The doctors were talking about experimental treatments, but our insurance had maxed out. The bank had given us final notice. On the farm, our heritage seeds were the only thing of value we had left, and they were locked in Heartland's vault, labelled as their property. As Thomas finished his testimony, the afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows. Across the floor, the light caught the tears in Margaret's eyes, making them shine like diamonds as she watched her husband tell their truth to the world. In that moment, the case had transformed from a simple matter of theft into something far more complex, a story of survival, heritage, and the changing face of American agriculture. District Attorney Chen rose for cross-examination with the practiced grace of a predator. Her high heels clicked against the hardwood floor like a metronome counting down Thomas Anderson's remaining moments of dignity. The afternoon light had shifted, casting harsh shadows across the courtroom that seemed to mirror the darkening atmosphere. "Mr. Anderson," she began, her voice carrying a razor's edge of contempt, "you've given us quite the emotional story. But let's focus on facts, shall we?" She lifted a document from her desk, holding it like a weapon. "Is this your signature on the Heartland Agricultural Corporation's standard purchasing agreement from 3 years ago?" Thomas squinted at the paper. "Yes, but... And this agreement clearly states that any seeds purchased from Heartland are protected by patent law and cannot be replicated, saved, or reused without explicit permission. Isn't that correct?" "It does, but those weren't just their seeds." "A simple yes or no will suffice, Mr. Anderson," Chen cut him off sharply. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Clayton Hughes leaned forward in his chair, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched the prosecutor dismantle Thomas's testimony. Behind him, his team of corporate lawyers scribbled notes furiously, their pens scratching like rats in the walls of a dying farmhouse. "You mentioned your grandfather's seeds," Chen continued, pacing before the witness box. "Do you have any proof that the specific genetic strains you attempted to steal were actually derived from your family's crops?" Thomas's hands clenched in his lap. "Those seeds were passed down through generations. Every farmer in the valley knows." "Again, Mr. Anderson, do you have any scientific or legal documentation proving your claim?" Chen's interruption was swift and merciless. "No, but in fact," Chen pressed on, retrieving another document, "according to Heartland's research records, these drought-resistant strains were developed through years of laboratory work and millions of dollars in investment. Your family's heirloom seeds are irrelevant to the proprietary genetics in question." Martinez half rose from his chair. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is testifying." "Sustained," Judge Harrison intoned, but the damage was already done. The jury had seen Thomas's hesitation, his lack of documentation, his apparent disregard. For legal agreements, Chen changed tactics, her voice softening deceptively. "Mr. Anderson, you mentioned your daughter's illness. It must be incredibly difficult." She paused, allowing sympathy to creep into her tone. "Would you say you were desperate?" Thomas stared at her, sensing the trap but unsure how to avoid it. "Any father would be. Desperate enough to steal, to break into a secure facility, to destroy years of research that could help thousands of farmers just to save your own farm." Margaret Anderson stood up abruptly, unable to contain herself. "That's not what happened." Her voice cracked with emotion. "Mrs. Anderson, please be seated," Judge Harrison warned, "or you'll be removed from the courtroom." Clayton Hughes chose this moment to whisper something to his lead attorney, who immediately passed a note to the district attorney. Chen's eyes gleamed as she read it. "Mr. Anderson," she continued, "are you aware that your actions that night damaged several experimental crops in the research greenhouse? Crops that were being developed to help feed people in drought-stricken regions of Africa. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Thomas's face paled. I never went near the greenhouse. I was only in the seed vault. We have security footage showing. Someone matching your description entering the greenhouse at 2:43 a.m., Chen declared triumphantly. She nodded to a court officer who wheeled in another monitor. The grainy footage showed a dark figure moving through the greenhouse. The image was blurry, the figure's face impossible to distinguish clearly, but the build and movement pattern were similar enough to Thomas's to plant seeds of doubt. Those experimental crops represented millions in research and humanity's best. And hope for fighting global hunger, Chen continued, her voice rising with practiced indignation. Your selfish actions may have set that research back by years. Martinez jumped to his feet. Objection! This footage wasn't part of the original evidence submission. We haven't had time to verify its authenticity. Your Honor, Chen responded smoothly. This evidence only came to light during our ongoing investigation. We can prove its authenticity through our security team's testimony. Judge Harrison frowned. I'll allow it, but the defense will be given time to review and challenge the footage if they wish. In the gallery, Dany Anderson watched his father's shoulders slump under the weight of this new accusation. The teenage boy's hands balled into fists as he saw Clayton Hughes lean back in his chair, satisfaction written across his corporate face. Mr. Anderson, Chen pressed on, if you were so concerned about your family's heritage seeds, why didn't you pursue legal channels? File a patent challenge? Seek arbitration? Thomas looked exhausted. We couldn't afford the lawyers. Every penny we had was going to Emily's treatments and trying to save the farm, so you took the law into your own hands. Chen's voice dripped with disapproval. Decided that your personal problems justified breaking and entering, theft, and the destruction of valuable research. I didn't destroy anything, Thomas insisted, but his voice had lost its strength. The confidence he'd shown during his earlier testimony had been systematically dismantled by Chen's relentless attack. From the back of the courtroom, old Bill Jenkins watched with growing anger as the corporate machine ground down another small farmer. He remembered how things used to be, before companies like Heartland started buying up patents on life itself. But his sympathy, like the sympathy of many others in the room, couldn't change the cold reality of the law. The weight of District Attorney Chen's cross-examination hung heavy in the courtroom as Thomas Anderson stepped down from the witness stand. His feet seemed to drag across the floor, each step an effort against the crushing gravity of his situation. The afternoon sun had disappeared behind gathering storm clouds, casting the courtroom in a greyish pallor that matched the despair on Thomas's face. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess, but Thomas remained slumped in his chair at the defense table. Margaret tried to catch his eye, but he kept his gaze fixed on his weathered hands. Hands that had worked the soil for decades, now possibly facing years holding prison bars instead of plow handles. James Martinez, the young defense attorney, spread his documents across the table with trembling fingers. Each paper seemed to mock their defense strategy. The family photographs now appeared sentimental rather than evidential. The old farming journals looked quaint against Heartland's sophisticated documentation, and their emotional appeals felt naive in the face of corporate law. I've failed you, Martinez whispered to Thomas, his voice thick with defeat. They had evidence we didn't know about, the greenhouse footage. I should have anticipated something like this. His legal pad was covered in frantically scribbled notes, each potential argument now crossed out or marked with question marks. Through the courtroom windows, they could see the Heartland Agricultural Corporation's massive research facility on the horizon, its modern glass buildings gleaming like a crown above the struggling family farms that surrounded it. The facility seemed to represent everything that had gone wrong with farming, the transformation of a way of life into a corporate commodity. Clayton Hughes used the recess to hold an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps. Local reporters clustered around him as rain began to fall, their cameras capturing his practiced, concerned expression. "This is a sad day for agricultural innovation," he announced, his voice carrying through the open courthouse windows. "When desperate individuals resort to destroying valuable research, they're not just hurting our company, they're hurting every farmer who depends on our advances in crop science." Inside, Dany Anderson couldn't take it anymore. The 16-year-old stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Dad, tell them about the night Mom called the ambulance for Emily. Tell them how Mr. Hughes wouldn't even—" "Dany, please." Margaret pulled her son back down, her voice breaking. "Not now." She glanced anxiously at the jury members returning to their seats, several of them giving Dany disapproving looks for his outburst. Thomas watched his son's face crumple in frustrated tears, and something inside him seemed to break. This was supposed to be Dany's legacy, the farm, the knowledge passed down through generations, the pride of working your own land. Instead, he was watching his father being branded a criminal, their family name being dragged through the mud. The courthouse clerk, Sarah Matthews, distributed copies of the new greenhouse security footage to the jury. Thomas could see their expressions changing as they reviewed the images, doubt creeping in where sympathy had been. The grainy figure in the footage could have been anyone of similar build, but the prosecution had planted the seed of suspicion, and it was growing like a weed in fertile soil. District Attorney Chen conferred quietly with her corporate legal team, their huddle occasionally breaking into satisfied smiles. They had brought out their biggest weapons: patent law, property, rights, and the suggestion of eco-terrorism. Thomas's story of desperate father trying to save his family's heritage had been rewritten into a tale of a disgruntled farmer attacking technological progress. Rain began drumming harder against the courthouse windows, and thunder rolled in the distance. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon was finally breaking, much like Thomas's spirit. He thought about Emily in her hospital room, probably watching the same storm, waiting for news about her father's fate. The doctors had said she needed another round of treatments they couldn't afford if he was in prison. Margaret reached across the gallery divider to squeeze her husband's shoulder, but Thomas could barely feel it. All he could feel was the weight of his failure to save the farm, failure to protect his family's legacy, failure to be the provider his family needed. The proud farmer who had once won state awards for his corn yield now sat defeated, watching 40 years of reputation crumble under the assault of corporate lawyers. Old Bill Jenkins made his way to the front of the gallery during the recess, his arthritic legs protesting each step. He leaned forward to whisper to Thomas, "Son, I remember when your grandfather brought those first seeds over. He'd be proud you tried to protect them." But even this attempt at comfort only served to highlight how much had been lost, how far they had fallen. Judge Harrison returned to his bench, his face as stormy as the weather outside. The few moments of recess had done nothing to soften his stern demeanor. If anything, he seemed more severe, as if Thomas's emotional testimony had offended his sense of legal propriety. James Martinez gathered his remaining documents with shaking hands, knowing he had little left to offer in his client's defense. The young lawyer had taken this case believing in justice, believing that truth and necessity might outweigh strict legal interpretation. Now he was watching that idealism drain away like water into parched earth. As the bailiff called the court back to order, Thomas felt the full weight of his situation descend upon him. The careful documentation of Heartland's lawyers, the damaging security footage, the patent agreements he'd signed without fully understanding their implications, it all pointed to his guilt. The fact that he'd acted out of desperation to save his family seemed to matter less and less in the face of corporate property rights and contract law. Thunder crashed outside, making several people jump, but Thomas didn't move. He sat still as stone, watching his future, his family's future, and 200 years of farming tradition balanced on the edge of a legal precipice, ready to plummet into the abyss. Just as Judge Harrison prepared to resume proceedings, the heavy courtroom doors swung open with a thunderous crack that echoed through the chamber. All heads turned to see Dr. Catherine Wells, striding purposefully down the center aisle, her white lab coat still on, and hospital ID badge swinging from her neck. Behind her came two other figures, a tall man in a crisp business suit carrying a briefcase, and a younger woman clutching a laptop to her chest. "Your Honor," Dr. Wells called out, her voice clear and authoritative. "I apologize for interrupting, but this court needs to hear critical evidence pertinent to this case." She moved forward with the confidence of someone used to commanding operating rooms rather than courtrooms. Judge Harrison's face darkened with annoyance. "This is highly irregular. Who are you and what gives you the right to interrupt these proceedings?" "I'm Dr. Catherine Wells, Chief of Oncology at Central Children's Hospital and Emily Anderson's primary physician." She gestured to her companions. "With me are Michael Torres, former legal counsel for Heartland Agricultural Corporation, and Sarah Chen, no relation to the district attorney, a data analyst who worked in Heartland's research division until 3 weeks ago." Clayton Hughes shot up from his seat, face flushing red. "Objection, Your Honor. This is completely inappropriate. Dr. Wells has no standing in this case, and Mr. Torres is bound by attorney-client privilege." The tall man with the briefcase stepped forward. "Your Honor, I filed my privilege waiver this morning under whistleblower protection statutes. I have documentation of corporate malfeasance that directly relates to this case." District Attorney Chen's practiced composure cracked slightly. "Your Honor, this is clearly a publicity stunt. The defense is trying to turn this into a circus." James Martinez looked as surprised as everyone else. "Your Honor, I had no knowledge of these witnesses, but I move that the court hear them out. There could be crucial evidence." "Evidence?" Hughes scoffed loudly. "These people are disgruntled former employees and a doctor who's clearly overstepped her bounds." Judge Harrison raised his gavel for silence, his steel-grey eyes studying the newcomers carefully. The storm outside had reached its peak, rain lashing against the windows as if nature itself demanded these voices be heard. "Approach the bench," Harrison commanded. The new arrivals, along with both attorneys, moved forward. Thomas watched from his seat, hardly daring to breathe, as an intense discussion unfolded in hushed tones. After several minutes, Judge Harrison straightened in his chair. "While this is highly unusual, I'm going to allow this testimony. The jury will remain, and these statements will be entered into the record." He fixed Dr. Wells with a stern look. "But this had better be relevant to the case at hand." Dr. Wells took the stand first, placing a thick medical file before her. "I've been treating Emily Anderson for leukemia for the past 18 months. 3 months ago, we identified a promising experimental treatment, but it required genetic testing to determine compatibility." She opened the file, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "During genetic screening, we discovered something remarkable. Emily's DNA showed markers that matched a specific genetic sequence, one that's been at the center of a major research project." She paused, looking directly at Clayton Hughes. "A project being conducted by Heartland Agricultural Corporation." A courtroom erupted in murmurs. Hughes's face had gone from red to ashen. "Mr. Torres," Dr. Wells continued, "discovered that Heartland had been conducting unauthorized genetic research using DNA samples from local farming families, samples collected through their seed program. They weren't just patenting seeds, they were patenting genetic sequences found in the farmers themselves." Michael Torres stepped forward, opening his briefcase. I have internal memos and research documents proving that Heartland knew the Anderson family's genetic line carried a unique resistance to certain plant diseases. They've been using that genetic information without consent or compensation. The young data analyst, Sarah Chen, connected her laptop to the courtroom's display system. These are research logs showing how Heartland tracked genetic markers through generations of farming families. The proprietary genetics they claim to have developed were actually stolen from the very people they're now suing for theft. Thomas sat stunned as the truth unfolded. His grandfather's seeds hadn't just been hardy. They had carried genetic traits that his family had unknowingly passed down through generations, traits that Heartland had discovered, stolen, and weaponized against the very families they had. Come from Dr. Wells turned to face the jury directly. The treatment Emily needs, it's based on research that wouldn't exist without her own family's genetic material that Heartland patented and now charges millions to access. They knew about the connection to the Anderson family's genetics, but when Thomas came, begging for help with his daughter's medical bills, they turned him away. They were literally denying him access to his own genetic heritage. The young data analyst pulled up more documents on the screen. Heartland didn't just do this to the Andersons. They've been collecting and patenting genetic information from farming families across the country. The seed contracts farmers signed included fine print giving Heartland the right to study any organic material submitted, including pollen and plant tissue samples that contained the farmer's own DNA from handling the crops. Clayton Hughes leaped to his feet again. "Your Honor, this is absurd. These allegations are completely unfounded, but Michael Torres was already producing more documents. I have here the internal memo where Mr. Hughes specifically instructed the legal team to bury information about the genetic research program in deliberately complex contract language. And here," he held up another paper, "is the email where he ordered security to deny Thomas Anderson access to the facility even after learning about his daughter's condition." The jury members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from doubt to shock as the evidence mounted. The greenhouse security footage that had seemed so damaging earlier now felt like a desperate corporate attempt to discredit a man who had stumbled upon their darkest secret. Thunder crashed outside once more, but this time it felt like punctuation. Nature's exclamation point to each new revelation. Margaret Anderson had her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the full scope of what they had been fighting against. Dany sat beside her, his young face a mix of anger and vindication as he watched the corporate giant begin to crumble under the weight of its own secrets. Sarah Chen, the former data analyst, moved through her presentation with methodical precision, each slide revealing another layer of Heartland's deception. The courtroom's overhead lights gleamed off her glasses as she pointed to complex charts and highlighted documents, transforming corporate jargon into damning evidence. "This spreadsheet shows how Heartland tracked genetic markers through farming communities," she explained, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. They specifically targeted families with multi-generational farming histories, especially those with unusual crop resilience or disease resistance. The Andersons' line was of particular interest because of their crops' historic survival rates during drought periods. Michael Torres stepped forward, producing a thick stack of internal memos. "Your Honor, these documents show a deliberate corporate strategy. Heartland wasn't just patenting seeds, they were systematically collecting and patenting human genetic sequences without consent or compensation." Clayton Hughes's legal team huddled in frantic whispers, papers shuffling as they tried to mount a defense against this flood of evidence. Hughes himself sat rigid in his chair, his normally confident demeanor cracking under the weight of exposed truth. Dr. Wells took over, her medical expertise lending gravity to the technical details. The genetic markers Heartland patented from the Anderson family line show remarkable adaptability to environmental stress. These same characteristics make Emily's treatment possible. But instead of celebrating this discovery and helping the family it came from, Heartland buried it in patent applications and profit projections. The jury listened intently as she explained the medical implications, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding to outrage. One juror, a retired science teacher, was taking detailed notes, her face growing darker with each revelation. "Your Honor," District Attorney Chen interjected, rising from her seat. "While these revelations are concerning, they don't change the fact that Mr. Anderson broke into a secure facility and attempted to steal proprietary materials." "Attempted to steal?" Michael Torres countered, producing another document. "According to Heartland's own research logs, Thomas Anderson has more right to those seeds than they do." This internal memo explicitly acknowledges the Anderson family's genetic contribution to their drought-resistant strain. The young data analyst pulled up a new series of slides. These are emails between Heartland executives discussing how to handle genetic source families, their term for people like the Andersons. They deliberately structured their contracts to hide the fact that they were collecting and patenting human genetic material along with plant genetics. Thomas sat straighter in his chair as the true scope of the situation became clear. He wasn't just fighting for his family's farm or his daughter's treatment. He was fighting against a corporation that had stolen the very essence of his family's agricultural heritage. James Martinez, finding new confidence, approached the bench. "Your Honor, in light of these revelations, I move to have all charges against my client dismissed. Furthermore, we'll be filing a countersuit for illegal genetic appropriation and patent fraud." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Sarah Chen displayed more evidence. Maps showing how Heartland had tracked and targeted specific farming families, research notes detailing genetic sequences extracted from unknowing farmers, and profit projections based on patenting human genetic material. "This goes beyond the Andersons," she explained, pulling up a database. "Heartland has been doing this to farming communities across the country. They've effectively patented the genetic heritage of hundreds of farming families without their knowledge or consent." Dr. Wells returned to the stand, her medical file open before her. "Emily's case brought this to light, but she's not alone. There are other children, other families, who could benefit from medical treatments developed from their own genetic material. Treatments Heartland has essentially locked away behind patent walls." From the gallery, other farmers began standing, up, recognition dawning on their faces. Bill Jenkins rose slowly, his voice shaking with anger. "They took samples from my grandson's corn crop last year, said they were doing a free soil analysis. They collected tissue samples from all our test fields," another farmer called out. "Said it was for quality control." The storm outside had begun to fade, but the atmosphere in the courtroom only grew more charged. Judge Harrison leaned forward, studying the evidence with intense concentration. Even his stern demeanor had cracked slightly in the face of these revelations. Clayton Hughes finally stood, straightening his expensive tie. "Your Honor, these accusations are being taken out of context. Our research methods are standard industry practice." "Standard practice?" Michael Torres interrupted, holding up another document. "Is it standard practice to specifically target children of farming families for genetic sampling? Because this memo outlines a program to collect DNA samples through a supposed young farmers initiative at county fairs." Margaret Anderson gasped audibly at this, remembering how Heartland representatives had taken cheek swabs from local children, claiming it was part of a health study. Dany reached for his mother's hand, understanding now why Thomas had become so angry when he discovered the truth. Sarah Chen pulled up one final document, an email from Clayton Hughes himself. "This message, sent just 3 months ago, shows that Mr. Hughes was fully aware of Emily Anderson's condition and the genetic connection to Heartland's patents. He specifically ordered that information be withheld from the family. The evidence was overwhelming. What had begun as a simple case of alleged seed theft had transformed into an exposé of corporate exploitation on a massive scale. Thomas Anderson stood accused of stealing seeds, but Heartland had stolen something far more precious, the genetic heritage of generations of farming families. As the final pieces of evidence were presented, Judge Harrison removed his glasses, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. The case had transformed before his eyes, growing from a simple matter of property law into something that could redefine the boundaries between corporate rights and human dignity. Judge William Harrison sat silently in his chambers during the emergency recess he had called, the weight of the morning's revelations pressing down on him like a physical force. Through the window, he could see the storm clouds finally breaking apart, scattered by a wind that promised change. The same wind seemed to be blowing through his carefully ordered world of legal precedents and statutory certainties. His fingers traced the edges of an old photograph he kept hidden in his desk drawer, a picture of his own father standing proud before a small farmhouse, dated 1962. Harrison had never shared the story of how that farm was lost to corporate interests, how his father had died believing the law had failed him. It was a memory he had buried beneath years of strict adherence to legal code and unwavering interpretation of property rights. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, quickly returning the photograph to its drawer. Sarah Matthews, his clerk, entered with a stack of hastily assembled legal precedents. "Your Honor, I found several cases that might be relevant to this situation." She hesitated, then added, "including Whitmore versus Agricultural Genetics Corporation from 1987, the case your father was involved in." Harrison's head snapped up. "How did you know about that?" "My grandmother lost her farm in that same case. Your Honor, she used to tell me about the judge who wanted to rule in the farmer's favor but was overturned on appeal." Sarah placed the files on his desk. "That judge was your father, wasn't it?" The elderly judge removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes tiredly. "Dad always said the law needed to serve people, not just profits. I thought he was being naive." He picked up one of the new files. "I've spent 30 years believing justice meant following the letter of the law, no matter the human cost." Outside his chamber windows, he could see the Heartland facility looming over the valley's patchwork of family farms. The modern buildings seemed less impressive now, their gleaming surfaces hiding darker truths about corporate greed and human exploitation. "Your Honor," Sarah ventured, "there's something else you should see." She opened her laptop, pulling up court records. "I've been doing some research into Heartland's other legal cases. They've been using the same tactics across the country, targeting historically successful farming families, hiding genetic research behind seed contracts, then using patent law to control not just crops, but human genetic material." Harrison leaned forward, scanning the documents. Cases in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, all following the same pattern. Families with generations of farming success suddenly finding themselves trapped in legal battles over their own genetic heritage. "They're not just stealing seeds," he murmured. "They're stealing history, family histories, human histories." His father's words echoed in his memory. "The law must protect more than property. It must protect people's connection to the land, to their heritage, to their very selves." A second knock interrupted them. Dr. Wells stood in the doorway, her white coat now wrinkled from hours in the courtroom. "Judge Harrison, I thought you should know. Emily Anderson's latest test results came in. The treatment she needs, it's based on genetic research that Heartland patented using her own family's DNA. They're literally charging her family for access to their own genetic material." The judge's hands clenched into fists on his desk. "How many other families?" he asked. "Quietly. We've identified at least 30 cases in this county alone," Dr. Wells replied. "Children, elderly patients, all being denied access to treatments developed from their own genetic markers, all because Heartland claims ownership through their seed patents." Harrison stood, moving to his chamber window. The afternoon sun had finally broken through the clouds, illuminating the valley below. He could see Thomas Anderson's farm from here, the faded red barn, the fields lying fallow, the generations of history written in every acre. "Sarah," he said finally, "bring me everything we have on patent law regarding genetic material, and get me the transcripts from Whitmore v's Agricultural Genetics." He turned back to his desk with newfound purpose. It's time to look at this case through a different lens. As his clerk hurried to comply, Harrison remembered his father's last words to him. "Sometimes, son, justice requires more than just following the law. It requires changing it." He had dismissed those words as idealistic then. Now, 30 years later, they rang with profound truth. The judge spent the next hour poring over cases, regulations, and precedents, but this time he wasn't looking for ways to uphold the strict letter of the law. Instead, he was searching for the spirit of justice his father had always championed, justice that recognized the human element in legal disputes. He found himself reading Thomas Anderson's initial testimony again, but now every word carried new weight. The desperate father fighting for his daughter's life, the farmer trying to protect generations of agricultural heritage, the man standing up against corporate giants who had turned family histories into commodities. It all painted a picture that went far beyond simple property law. When Judge Harrison finally returned to the courtroom, his usual stern expression had been replaced by something different, a look of clarity and purpose that made even Clayton Hughes shift uncomfortably. In his seat, the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor as he took his place at the bench. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. The man who had begun the day as an unbending arbiter of strict legal code now sat ready to consider justice in its fullest, most human sense. His father's picture seemed to burn in his drawer, a reminder that some legacies were worth protecting, even if it meant challenging the very system you had served for decades. Judge Harrison's gavel struck with decisive force, silencing the murmuring courtroom. The afternoon sun had emerged fully now, streaming through the tall windows and illuminating the judge's face as he prepared to deliver his ruling. The transformation in his demeanor was evident to everyone present. Gone was the cold, procedural arbitrator of the morning, replaced by a man who seemed to carry the weight of generations in his expression. "Before I deliver my ruling," Harrison began, his voice carrying a new depth of authority, "I want to address the extraordinary circumstances that have come to light in this courtroom today." He removed his glasses, making direct eye contact with Thomas Anderson. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of theft and trespassing. These are serious charges, and under normal circumstances, they would demand serious consequences." Clayton Hughes straightened in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "the evidence presented today reveals a far more serious crime, one that strikes at the very heart of our agricultural heritage and human rights." He lifted the stack of documents provided by Michael Torres. Heartland, agricultural corporations, systematic exploitation of farming families' genetic material without informed consent represents a gross violation of both legal and ethical boundaries. The judge turned his attention to Hughes, who had begun to fidget uncomfortably. "Mr. Hughes, in light of the evidence presented, I am ordering an immediate federal investigation into Heartland's genetic research program, all patents derived from unauthorized genetic sampling are hereby suspended pending review. The corporate legal team erupted in protests, but Harrison's gavel crashed down again. Furthermore, I am ordering Heartland to establish a medical trust fund for all families affected by their genetic research program, with immediate attention to Emily Anderson's treatment needs. Margaret Anderson grabbed her husband's hand, tears streaming down her face as the judge continued. As for the charges against Thomas Anderson, Harrison's voice softened slightly, they are hereby dismissed. Mr. Anderson's actions, while technically in violation of the law, were a desperate response to what I consider to be corporate theft of his family's genetic heritage. Thomas slumped in his chair, relief washing over him in visible waves. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. His next words rang through the courtroom. With historic weight, this case has exposed a dangerous gap in our legal system, one that allows corporations to patent and profit from human genetic material without proper consent or compensation. I'm recommending a full review of agricultural patent law as it pertains to genetic material, and I will be personally forwarding my findings to the state Supreme Court. The judge then turned to address the jury directly. Members of the jury, you are dismissed with the court's thanks. Your service here today has witnessed what I believe will be a turning point in agricultural law and corporate accountability. Clayton Hughes shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is unprecedented. We will appeal. Mr. Hughes, Harrison cut him off, his voice sharp as a scythe. You might want to consult with your attorneys about your own legal exposure before making any declarations. The evidence presented today suggests criminal liability for knowingly withholding medical information from affected families. The corporate executive's face drained of color as federal marshals appeared at the courtroom doors. One of them approached, Hughes with a warrant, while others began securing Heartland's documents and computers. In the gallery, farmers who had been watching the proceedings began to stand one by one like stalks of wheat rising after a storm. Bill Jenkins was the first to reach Thomas, enveloping him in a bear hug that spoke of decades of friendship and shared struggles. Dr. Wells approached Margaret, holding out a file. We can begin Emily's treatment immediately. The court order gives us access to all the necessary protocols. The mother broke down in tears of relief, clutching the doctor's hands in gratitude. James Martinez, the young defense attorney, sat at his table in stunned disbelief, watching as his first major case transformed into a landmark decision. Sarah Matthews, the judge's clerk, was already preparing the necessary documents to begin the broader investigation into Heartland's practices. Judge Harrison wasn't finished with his pronouncements. In addition to the dismissal of charges, this court orders the immediate return of all genetic material and seed samples to their original family sources. Heartland's claim to these materials through deceptive contracts is hereby nullified. He turned to address the broader audience in the courtroom. For too long, we have allowed corporate interests to supersede human rights in the name of progress and profit. Today, in this courtroom, that changes. He lifted a document from his desk. I am establishing a task force to review all agricultural patents in this jurisdiction that may have been obtained through similar means. Dany Anderson, watching from the gallery, saw his father stand straighter, the weight of shame and accusation finally lifting from his shoulders. The teenager realized he was witnessing more than just his father's vindication. He was seeing the protection of a way of life for future generations of farmers. As the afternoon sun painted the courtroom in warm hues, Judge Harrison delivered his final words. This court stands adjourned, but our work is just beginning. The rights of farming families to their genetic heritage, the fruits of generations of agricultural knowledge, and the basic human dignity of all those affected by corporate overreach must be protected. His voice carried the weight of personal conviction as he added, "Justice demands nothing less." The impact of his words rippled through the courtroom like wind through a wheat field, carrying the promise of change and renewal. Thomas Anderson stood in the center of it all, no longer accused but vindicated, no longer a thief but a defender of something precious. The right of farmers to maintain their connection to the land and their own genetic heritage. 2 months after the historic court ruling, Thomas Anderson stood in his fields at sunrise, watching the first green shoots of spring push through the rich, dark soil. The morning dew sparkled like diamonds on newly sprouted corn leaves. Plants, grown from his family's original seed stock, returned to him by court order, along with all other materials Heartland had taken. At the local children's hospital, Emily Anderson sat up in her bed, color returning to her cheeks as she responded. Well, to the treatment that was now freely available to her and other affected families. The medical trust fund, established by the court's ruling, had ensured that no family would have to choose between their heritage and their children's health ever again. Clayton Hughes and several Heartland executives faced federal charges for their role in the genetic exploitation scheme. The corporate giant's unethical practices had been exposed nationwide, leading to similar investigations in other farming communities across the country. The small farmers of Millbrook Valley had sparked a movement that was reshaping agricultural law and corporate accountability. Judge William Harrison had framed his father's photograph and hung it prominently in his chambers, a daily reminder that true justice required both wisdom and compassion. His ruling had become required reading in law schools, cited as a landmark case in balancing corporate rights against human dignity and cultural heritage. Thomas made his way to the old barn where Dany was already at work, learning the farming techniques passed down through generations. The teenager had started a youth farming program, teaching other young people about sustainable agriculture and the importance of preserving agricultural heritage. The same courthouse that had almost destroyed their family now hosted monthly meetings of the Family Farming Rights Association, with Thomas serving as its first president. Margaret Anderson had transformed their kitchen table, once covered in unpaid bills and foreclosure notices, into a community gathering space where farmers shared stories, seeds, and support. The Anderson farm had become a symbol of resistance and renewal, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come from standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. Dr. Catherine Wells continued her work at the hospital, but now she also served on a national ethics board overseeing genetic research in agriculture. Her testimony had sparked a broader conversation about the intersection of medical ethics and agricultural patents, leading to new protections for farming families nationwide. James Martinez, the once nervous young lawyer, had found his calling in agricultural law, representing family farmers and working to protect their rights. His office walls displayed news clippings about the Anderson case, his first major victory in what would become a distinguished career fighting corporate overreach. Old Bill Jenkins had expanded his farm supply store to include a seed bank, where local farmers could store and share their heritage seeds freely. The community that had nearly been torn apart by corporate greed had grown stronger, united in their determination to protect their agricultural heritage for future generations. As Thomas walked his fields that morning, he remembered standing in that courtroom, feeling small and defeated. Now he understood that sometimes the darkest moments could lead to the brightest dawns. His fight had become more than just a father's desperate attempt to save his daughter. It had become a beacon of hope for farming families everywhere. The story of the farmer who dared to stand up against corporate giants had spread far beyond Millbrook Valley. It reminded people that true justice wasn't just about following laws. It was about protecting the fundamental rights of ordinary people to their heritage, their dignity, and their future. Back in the courthouse, Sarah Matthews, Judge Harrison's clerk, had created a special archive documenting the case and its aftermath. Future generations would learn how one family's struggle had helped restore the balance between progress and tradition, between corporate rights and human dignity. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the fertile soil of Millbrook Valley. Thomas watched Dany working in the fields, his son's movements mirroring those of his grandfather and great-grandfather before him. The land remembered, Thomas thought, and now, thanks to their fight, so would everyone else. Some victories aren't measured in money or power, but in the preservation of things more precious: family, heritage, and the right to pass both on to future generations. The Anderson case had proved that even in the darkest moments, when all hope seemed lost, courage and truth could still prevail. As more families came forward with similar stories, the impact of that day in court continued to grow. The once mighty Heartland Agricultural Corporation had learned a powerful lesson. No amount of money or legal maneuvering could outweigh the combined power of justice, truth, and a community united in defense of its rights. The story of Thomas Anderson, the farmer who went from being branded a thief to becoming a champion of justice, would be told for generations to come. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in fields or boardrooms, but in the hearts and consciences of ordinary people who refuse to bow to injustice. If you found this story moving and believe in standing up for what's right, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring story of courage, justice, and the triumph of the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest victories come from daring to fight for what truly matters.